Welcome to The Long Game, Talking Pensions, the podcast that brings fresh insight to the challenges and opportunities in retirement planning. In this episode, we dig into the latest global advice study, which reveals a growing gap between what clients expect and what they're really on track for. Are your clients prepared or heading for a shortfall? Let's find out.
Hello and welcome to The Long Game, a pensions podcast for international financial advisors. I'm your host, Rachel Meadows, Managing Director at IFGL Pensions, and I'm joined by my co-host, IFGL Pensions Technical Manager, Steve Berridge. We'll be popping into your playlist periodically to talk about topical issues in the world of pensions. This episode, we're joined by special guest, Nigel Danselman, Head of Marketing Services and Communications at IFGL, to discuss the results of the recent global advice study, which we carried out in conjunction with International Investment and International Advisor magazines. Welcome, Nigel.
Hi, Rachel. Glad to be here.
Brilliant to have you. So, Nigel, tell us a little bit more about the study.
Yeah, we teamed up with International Advisor to ask financial advisors about their clients' attitudes towards retirement planning, and specifically about how financially prepared they felt their clients were for retirement. And the results were really quite revealing and worrying. I think at the heart of this was a massive gap between client expectations for their retirement and the reality of their current situation. The results highlighted that most clients are significantly underprepared and are likely to face a nasty surprise when they retire unless they take urgent and quite significant action. I think the most worrying finding was that only 5% of clients have a realistic understanding of the size of the pension pot that they will need for their retirement. 80% underestimate how much they will need, most of those by a really significant amount as well. And 15% had no idea at all about the size of the pot that they will require. So there's clearly a sort of a big education gap here. And then I think if you combine this with some of the other findings from the survey, the picture becomes even more concerning. So 60% of people, for example, expect, maintain, or have a higher standard of living when they retire than during their working life. But this expectation is being squeezed by a couple of other things the survey showed as well. So almost 3/4 of people expect to retire before they hit the age of 65. But on the other hand, nearly 2/3 of people don't start saving for their retirement until their late 30s. They're often saying that they've got more immediate concerns, more immediate financial pressures. So while these delays are completely understandable, the window to save and build for their part and benefit from all the good things like compound growth just gets smaller and narrower. So I think overall, the survey showed a real disconnect between what kind of retirement people expect and the type of retirement they're going to be able to afford. And I think this means a lot of people are going to be in for a really unpleasant shock as they approach retirement.
It's really quite stark, isn't it? The statistics that you cite there paint quite an eye-opening picture, really. It almost feels like for the majority of people, their financial plan is their hope and a prayer rather than a plan, an action plan.
Yeah, and I think that, again, it sort of came across that retirement can seem like a long time in the future. And when you've got, a mortgage to pay, you're starting a family, you've got these kind of day-to-day financial pressures. Retirement in 30 years' time is one of the costs that is sacrificed. And so, yes, there is a it'll be okay in the morning, that kind of attitude.
Steve, talk to us a little bit more about why is it such a big problem that people are only coming to retirement saving later in life for the understandable reasons that Nigel outlines here, but why is that such a big problem?
Yeah, I think, Rachel, it's an issue because people are just unaware of perhaps the size of the pension pot that they need to accumulate during their working life, which will provide them with the standard of living that they expect to receive. I mean, the survey is quite interesting that it seems the majority of people uh, believe they're going to require between 40 and 50,000. That was the highest percentage, and quite a number as well, over 50,000 a year, to live in retirement and to continue the life that they've become accustomed to. And perhaps there's an education piece here in terms of people becoming aware of exactly the size of the fund that they will need in retirement. I mean, if you look at the current annuity rate, around about 6% for 65-year-old. If you want to have an income, if you want a £50,000 income, you're going to need someone in the region of £750,000. So really, to get a fund of that size, people need to start very, very young. They need many, many years of putting money away into a pension policy, really, as soon as they start their working life. And of course, for the reasons Nigel's just outlined, people in their earlier days bringing up children, paying mortgages, particularly at the moment where we realise there's a cost of living crisis in this country, a lot of people are getting to sort of around 40 and the sort of then they get to that stage perhaps where they're looking, 15, 20 years might be a nice time to retire. And that's just simply not long enough to realistically put enough money away which is going to provide the kind of fund they'll need when they get to 60, 65 years old. So this is a real issue. It's an issue for people coming into retirement, Gen X. We can see unlikely to have the sort of level of pension provisions that the previous generation had, who enjoyed those DB pension schemes, and it's something that's probably going to become even worse as we go through down the generations, through the millennials. I guess, yeah, definitely for Gen Z, who are starting their working life now, it's really important to get them into good habits.
And I suppose the pension rules landscape also has an impact, doesn't it? Because in the past, if we roll back, 10 years or so, when annual allowances, the limits around how much you could save into pension were much higher, it might have been, setting affordability aside for a moment, it might have been a more viable strategy to, defer saving for retirement whilst you're younger and you've got family expenses, etc., and then save much bigger sums later in life. But the way that the rules have changed and the annual allowances have been reduced, and we've had the introduction of tapered annual allowances for those with higher earnings and potentially more affordability, it actually takes the ability to save those large sums later away from people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the government increased it a couple of years ago to 60,000, which was obviously welcome, but it's still relatively restrictive in terms of if you've got 10 years to pump money into a pension, for example. It's going to be something that's going to be a factor without a doubt.
I think as well that what's sort of clear here is that people want to retire, sometimes in their 50s, so they're going to have 10, 15 years perhaps of having to fund their retirement before any state pension kicks in at all. And then at the other end of the scale as well, we see people living longer as well. So, retirements can last well into people's 80s or even longer. So there's a longer period of time to fund as well. So as our expectations for retiring earlier increase and our living age, is increasing as well, then we're going to have to save even more than we have saved in the past.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's I guess a conflict, because it's a good news, bad news situation. Good news, you're living longer, and people are more active in retirement, and you can do more exciting things. You can travel for longer, and, wonderful news from a lifestyle perspective. Bad news, you've got to pay for that. And that takes a little bit of planning for, doesn't it? And I suppose that loops us back, Nigel, to this one of the statistics that came out of the Global Advice study, that over half of people expect to maintain the same standard of living in retirement, or even a higher standard than they enjoy whilst they're working. Only a third expecting their standard of living to decrease. How realistic is that?
Well, I think the results of this are fairly clear, that people don't understand how much they need to save. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we, as an industry, should be talking about and trying to educate clients, particularly young clients, about the size of the pot they're likely to need, about the need to start saving as early as possible, even if it's a small amount. Because I think one thing that happens here is if you start saving early, you get into good habits. So you might not need to save a lot in those early years, but you're already allocating a little bit of your income towards your retirement, and that can increase over time as some of those financial pressures that we talked about earlier sort of ease as you get into middle age and a bit later on. So I think there's a real job for all of us to get this message out into the world a lot more loudly than it's being heard at the moment.
And I suppose striking that very careful balance between clearly communicating the size of the task, but not scaring people off so that the task seems so daunting that it's insurmountable. And as you say, taking those early actions and small steps early on, good habits. Actually, this is in the realms of achievability for the vast majority of people if you're just armed with the right information early enough.
Yeah, I think there's a problem that as people approach their retirement, they start to worry more about how much money they'll have for the future. But of course, by then it's a bit too late, really, to have a significant impact on the amount of the size of their pension pot. So I think this starting early is a really key part of the issue.
And Steve, I guess for international financial advisors, there's an additional challenge here in that they're perhaps dealing with clients who are more geographically mobile, who are spending chapters of the career in different countries with different costs of living, and again might be tempted to defer saving for pension until later. What are the key actions that international financial advisors can take?
Yeah, I think financial advisors play a very important role here. I mean, one of the key areas which needs navigating quite carefully is the area of taxation. And I think international advisors can play a really good role here in helping clients. Even things like the dual taxation agreement sometimes need scrutinising just to make sure that clients who've got pension pots that maybe they got them from the UK and they're living abroad, and they're making sure that the right action is taken, so they're not being sort of charged taxation twice on the money in the UK, for example, and then when they bring it into the country of their residence, and then also just having that knowledge really of the different living standards. I mean, we've got a rough idea of what things cost in the UK. It can be very different in different countries around the world. It's just that kind of local expertise, which I think they can really bring to the table here, really helpful. We've got, for example, we've got a National Health Service in the UK. Have we got that kind of service available abroad? It's always a factor as people get older when they retire. So will they need private medical insurance, for example, things like that. So yeah, I definitely think there's a real role for our international advisors here to play in just helping people navigate through the right outcome when they're living abroad.
Nigel, what did the study indicate in terms of where people plan to retire?
Yeah, that was another question we asked actually about what their, where they intended to retire, and we sort of split this between expat clients and those who are working in or living in the UK still. So of the expat clients, only 4 out of 10 intended to retire back to their country around about sort of 20% expected to stay in the country that they're working and living in currently. But 40% of people intended to retire to a different country altogether. And I think Spain and Portugal in particular were destinations that were mentioned in the survey as popular retirement locations. On the UK side, even still, 20% of clients intended to live and retire abroad. So I think there's an opportunity here for advisors. That it's not just about asking when do you intend to retire; it's also asking about where do you intend to retire.
Yeah, it really does highlight the importance and value of that international financial planning, because that focus on the customer and not just their life objectives, but where those life objectives are going to be played out can make all the difference, can't it?
Absolutely. And as Steve said, in the UK, there are certain things that we take for advantage, like the NHS and social security, all of those sorts of things, pensions, and those may not be available if you're choosing to retire abroad. So understanding what you'll need, understanding the sort of tax situation, and all of those things are key things that an advisor can help a client with.
Steve, what are the future challenges that we as a whole industry here, so pension providers, financial advisors, other wealth management companies and product providers, what are the future challenges that we need to have on the radar when we're helping clients save for retirement? So just looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think there's a number of challenges. I think the regulatory picture is referenced in the survey. The increasing amount of regulation, is that going to change? Is that going to provide new barriers? And we've seen in the last sort of 6 or 7 months just the changes that have been brought in by the current government. It's likely to be something that continues. We're seeing increasing numbers of people actually at the moment appear to be moving abroad in the kind of wealth accumulation phase. So we're seeing quite an exodus to, for example, United Arab Emirates, places like Dubai, very popular for people who are looking to sort of maximise their earning potential during their work life. So we might have the sort of then people moving from that to another country as they retire. So that is another factor that needs to be brought into account. There's also been a lot of talk recently about the investment, the actual role of investment in providing future wealth, and how big an impact it can be if you invest in the wrong funds for too long a period. For example, we know that pension funds in the last 5 years, there's usually a lifestyling element, and there's been talk about pension assets being managed too conservatively. So there's another piece there about the need to look long term in terms of investment. So the challenge really, I guess, is in trying to create yourself such a big pension pot. Sort of the role of the investment advisor can be quite key. Against that, of course, we have the regulatory challenges that we've seen in terms of, on the one hand, we've got the government at the moment, for example, key to encourage the big pension funds to invest in sort of startups and sort of private equity type ventures, but also recently we've had the challenges of SIP providers, for example, something close to home, where members have invested in more adventurous assets, and there's been sort of more of a tightening in terms of regulator looking at the kind of assets that people invest in. So we've got all those different challenges really that we need to look at. So they're definitely interesting times at the moment.
I suppose on the customer side, when advisors are working with their customers, their clients, structurally we'll see less and less customers reaching the point of retirement with defined benefit plans, so less and less secure income locked in at that point of retirement. So more dependence on the amount of money that they've saved within their defined contribution pots, the SIPs, and other pension products. So that places more onus back on the customer, a more important role for advisors to play, arguably, than in the past. And lower levels of home ownership, and that isn't something that we're only seeing in the UK. I think around a number of economies around the world, we're seeing housing costs reach levels where it's out of the realms of affordability for a number of people. And so the reality is they're renting during their working life, and they may well need to rent during their retirement as well. And that creates a different demand on your pension income as well, doesn't it? As well as the longer lives, which Nigel talked to earlier. It's clear, I think, that we could talk about this for hours, but let's bring this chat to a close with a top takeaway from each of you. So, Nigel, what's your top takeaway from the Global Advice study?
I think my top takeaway will be the need to educate people about the size of the pension pot they're going to need for the future, and to start preparing as early as possible to build as big a pot as possible.
Steve, your top takeaway?
Yeah, I think similar to Nigel, I think this just highlights really the key importance of advisors in getting alongside customers at an early stage and just providing that kind of level of support and education to people, not just as they get into middle age, but when they're much younger, getting them into good habits.
Thanks both. Nigel, thanks so much for being an excellent guest and for such an interesting pension conversation. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you soon in the next episode of The Long Game, a pensions podcast for international financial advisors.
Thanks for listening to The Long Game, Talking Pensions, brought to you by IFGL Pensions. If you found this episode useful, please follow or subscribe so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more insightful conversations coming your way.